Jay said to me, well, why don't you come to Speaker's Corner and see what we do? So 4 weeks later, I turned up and there was Jay with 2 ladders. And I went, why have you got 2 ladders? He went, well, Andy, I'm going to stand on one and preach. And you're going to stand on the other and preach. I thought, Jay, you said, come and see what we do. He went, oh, best view's up a ladder. I went, I've never preached on the street before. He went, it's easy. I said, I've never talked to Muslims before. Oh, they're easy. Both those things utterly wildly wrong. The Muslims there tore me to pieces. It was an absolute road crash. But it gave me a bug to get into this because I thought, I need to get some answers. They've asked really good questions. And that drove me to kind of reading to try and find answers to the questions they'd asked.
Welcome, everybody. This is Simon Gilbert with Inspired. Inspired, if you're new to us, is all about meeting different mates of mine from all sorts of different journeys and life experiences, and hopefully in an hour's time leaving inspired, because the fact is we're relentlessly bombarded by negativity and bad news and stuff that induces fear and cynicism. So this completely counteracts that, and I've got no doubt that you're going to be inspired because we've got with us Andy Bannister. Welcome, Andy.
Simon, it's great to be on the show. I love the whole vision. So we live in a cynical, fearful age, so let's just fight back. And I love the work that you're doing on this show to just push back against that.
Yeah, thanks, mate. So our paths first crossed actually during lockdown when I was doing this book, and I wanted to get you to write the chapter because you hold a PhD in Islamic studies. So it's a chapter on Islam. Anyway, that book never came to fruition, but I was glad to come across you then, and then we've met subsequently at J. John's Evangelist Conference. I love what you do. I listen to you whenever you come out with a podcast. You do 2 podcasts, don't you? So one with Solas, which is your main job. You're the director of Solas Centre for Public Christianity. And then the other one is Pod of the Gaps. We had on Aaron Edwards, who's your partner in crime on that one, a few months ago, and he gave us a great hour. And so if you're interested, well, just mention Pod of the Gaps. Go for it now.
Yeah, so there's 2. So Pod of the Gaps, we'll talk about Solas in a minute, but Pod of the Gaps was actually a lockdown thing that Aaron and I and Anna, we had a third presenter, a guy called Michael Lotz back then. We were all bored during lockdown, climbing up the walls. We started having these Zoom conversations where we were discussing theology and culture and the gospel and big ideas. And then I forget which one of us was like, we should try this as a podcast. And we did. We thought we'd have a go because, again, lots of spare time during lockdown. And I think we thought that we might get like 10 listeners because we had no idea what we were doing. I mean, literally none. And, here we are 3 years on, something like that. And the thing is getting, 2,000 kind of listeners, which still boggles our mind because it's sort of quite scary, isn't it? When you suddenly realize that people are listening to your conversations. But Pod of the Gaps in a nutshell, we take big issues in culture that we think the church often isn't talking about well. There's a whole range of kind of things, and we try and explore those because we believe that the gospel sheds light on everything. It sheds light on us and relationship with God and culture and politics and everything. So we try and wrestle with some of those big issues, hopefully in a way that's winsome and provocative. If you listen to One of the Gaps, every episode will have something that annoys you and something that inspires you and excites you. That's the goal.
Yeah, well, I'm a fan, so that's great. Okay, let's go back. Get some backstory. How did you come to faith?
So I came to faith. I was born in South London, or South London, as we would have called it then, and I was blessed with being born into a Baptist kind of family, church-going family. My granddad used to joke that you don't need to be a Baptist to go to heaven, but why take chances? That was the sort of family motto. And so I remember going to church from a young age and really loved it, actually. I really, really enjoyed kind of church, and I was also part of a brilliant youth group called Crusaders, now rebranded as Urban Saints. But what happened then, Simon, I think like a lot of kids from that kind of background, around about 12, 13, I began realizing and cottoning on to the fact that the faith I had, or what I was doing, was my parents' faith. I was holding on to their coattails. I was going to church because they went. I was going to youth groups. They encouraged me to go, and that was all good and proper. But I began thinking, somehow this needs to become my own if this is real. And one of the things that Crusaders did as a youth program, it was brilliant back then. They did great Bible study and really got kids into scripture. But they also did amazing youth camps. And there was a youth camp round about 1984, 85, something like that. And it was down in Hastings on the south coast of England, up on the cliffs. And it was the night meeting, so it was an evening event, and it literally was a dark and stormy night. The rain was lashing the sides of the tent, gale blowing. And one of the youth leaders, I forget which one, we had a 40-year reunion the other year, and I was chatting to the old leaders there, and I still can't remember who it was who preached, but somebody preached a sermon that really connected. It was that moment where I really felt the Holy Spirit kind of grab hold of me and go, dude, you need to respond to this. And so I just got up at the end of that message, went forward, prayed for to receive Christ. Whether that was the moment I became a Christian or the moment that it became my faith, not just my parents' faith, but that was the big moment that I trace everything back to when I personally said yes to Jesus. So that's when it began as a teenager, and it kind of went from there, really. That was the beginning of the journey.
And smooth teenage years, or were you a tearaway?
Yeah, smooth. Well, I don't know. I think the phrase "smooth teenage years," Simon, is an oxymoron at the best of times. But it was certainly a case for me. I think a couple of things were going on. One was most of my friends were not Christian. So early on, I sort of was trying to figure out, well, what does it mean to be a Christian and for them not to be? And how do I explain what I believe? Typical boys' school, sort of faith and those kind of things mocked a little bit. So I really wasn't sure how to engage with that. And then it was also a very multicultural part of London. So the seeds of the Islam thing, I think, were planted there because one of my best mates at school, he was a Muslim. And I think back then I probably early on thought, well, I guess Muslims are just like me with a few differences. I have Jesus, they have Muhammad, I have the Bible, they have the Quran, I go to church, they go to mosque and so on. But obviously that's not right. And, those teenage years was navigating that. So really, I think those teenage years was figuring out, okay, where does Christianity engage with some of those embryonic big questions? And then the other big moment for me, the crisis moment in a sense early on in my faith time, wasn't my teens, it was my very early 20s, because in my early 20s I'd got a good job at that point. I was working for the NHS. I was doing youth ministry on the side, doing some stuff with an organisation called Youth for Christ, very involved in church. And so I was very, 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 very busy. And everything was going really well. But I hadn't realised I was burning out. I was working so hard because I was trying to basically prove myself, I think. I was trying to get my identity in work and in, sort of success and in serving. And also a friend and I had set a business up on the side. And so, working really hard in that. And I actually ended up with burnout, aged about 21, 22. And I remember going to see my GP and describe some of my symptoms. And my GP was a wise old bird, and he literally got me to open my diary up. He said, well, tell me about your typical week, Andy. And this dates this story, Simon, because I got my Filofax out. And so you know what that is. But younger listeners might go, what the heck is that? It's like a clockwork, iPhone. It's like, it's a paper-based kind of diary kind of thing that we all had at that period. And I talked my GP through the stuff I was doing. And I vividly remember his question. He looked at me, Simon, and he said, Andy, what are you trying to prove and to whom? What are you trying to prove and to whom? And he hadn't realized it. That was a spiritual question. And I hadn't realized, though I was a Christian by this point, I hadn't fully grasped what it meant to be in Christ and for my identity to be in Christ rather than things I did. And that was the kind of wake-up call to going, I need to reorientate some things, which I then did by the grace of God, and really realized that actually busyness and activity is great, but unless underneath it all is who we are in Christ, we're going to burn ourselves out trying to prove ourselves either to the world or to the church or to our mates.
So, I still picture you as utterly turbocharged, but do you have good life rhythms?
Although now, this is very interesting. If my wife was in this room, we might have...
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah. I think so. I think a few things changed me. There was that moment in my 20s was significant. Marriage was very, very significant. Astrid and I will have been married for 26 years this year, and God just gave me such a gift in her because among all the other things that she brings into our marriage, she's as stubborn and as opinionated as I am, which I needed because I can talk at like you probably at 1,000 miles an hour, and she's very good at asking awkward questions and saying no. So marriage reorientated some priorities, because when you get married, suddenly there's two of you, and you can't just make decisions for you. And then the other big thing was becoming a parent. So when my daughter was born in 2012, parenthood is life-changing, but it really was life-changing because suddenly that was not a wake-up call, but a real, I think, made me sit down and think about what kind of dad do I want to be? And I've always wanted to be and strive to be, and I get it wrong sometimes, many times, but I've always wanted to be someone who puts my kids and my family very high up the priority list. There's a temptation for those of us in Christian ministry, I think, that we can be tempted to sacrifice our children on the altar of ministry, and that's not a good look. And I firmly believe that, for those of us with families, God calls us. The calling is, God is first, then it's family, and then it's ministry and other activities. And that's a lesson I regularly have to get, check in and get rebalanced on, whether it's my wife rebalancing me. I've got a mentor who's quite good at asking awkward questions too.
Great. So backtracking, you recover from the burnout. Does that take a long time?
It's about 6 months to a year. I think that kind of happens, but that say reorientated a number of things. But then the other big thing in my life journey was actually before the burnout. So I would never write an autobiography because I'm all over the place. The other really big spiritual moment for me came when I was 18 because I was at that point I just finished A levels. I was thinking of doing. I had a place lined up at university to go and study artificial intelligence and linguistics because computer science fascinated me. I was also exploring the idea of doing a year out, doing a gap year. I'm working for a Christian organization that sent teams of young people off to work at churches at the other end of the country. And my teachers were all advising me, do your university degree. It's a good offer there from Sussex University. Sussex or Surrey, one of the two. And then even my parents were like, do university stuff, do your education, then take your gap year. So all the voices I respected were telling me that way. And I was walking home from a youth meeting kind of one night, and I heard God say to me, when people use that language, they often mean that, the interior sense. This was the only time in my entire Christian experience it's been, I have heard an external voice. It felt like an external voice. I remember stopping in the street and going, what was that? What just happened? And God said to me incredibly clearly, I want you to do the gap year. You need to defer the university place. So it was so overwhelming. There was no answer to that. And I told my parents, and there's no real answer to the trump card of God. God told me. So I did. I deferred the university place. And that was one of those sort of sliding door moments where I think your life could go that way or the other way. And I think that's why it was so dramatic, because I can trace so much of my life and my ministry kind of path and everything back to that decision, Simon. Because I went off to Sunderland and did a year working for a church up there. That was where I got connected with Youth for Christ. We've talked about that a little bit. And also at the end of that gap year, more gently, not as dramatically, but very clearly, I felt God saying, I actually want you to let the university place go. So I actually never went to university until I was 28, much later. And I came back to London after the gap year, got involved in youth ministry, got a job, pay the bills, and learned an awful lot. And it was actually through Youth for Christ that I met my wife. So if I hadn't had that dramatic moment on Northcote Road in Battersea, I can still remember the exact place and the exact street. It's that dramatic. I revisited that part of London 2-3 years ago, and I'm walking back along that street. I was like, Struth, this is where I had that power encounter with the Holy Spirit back in 1991. I can still remember. I almost feel there should be scorch marks on the pavement or something.
And actually, those who know you, that's not your normal language, is it? Some people will say, God told me all the time, but that's not how you're wired particularly, is it?
No, I mean, I'm a denominational gypsy in that I was raised in Baptist church, and I sort of joke that the Baptist church I grew up in, the Holy Spirit had to make an appointment, to come. Everything's very structured. And after that, I was in the Brethren Church for a while, and again, not a church known for spiritual stuff. But then, after I got married, Astrid and I were in an Ichthus congregation, so a house church sort of network in South London, founded by Roger and Faith kind of Forster, and that's where really I got more introduced to sort of charismatic things. And to cut a long story short, winding series of churches. Now we're in a Holy Trinity Brompton HTB plant in Swindon, near where we live, which is quite sort of Holy Spirit stuff going on. But me, I've sort of always been that's been there, but it's not. I would not describe myself as say a Pentecostal or those kind of things. So I use that language. I use that language carefully. So people listening to me know me may go, "Gosh, that's not a thing we've heard a lot of." And actually, quite deliberately, I also don't talk about that too much, because I think one of my concerns all over the years has always been, and I know when I was perhaps a younger Christian, having friends in more Pentecostal circles, sometimes then Christians who aren't from those traditions, you can feel almost like a second-class citizen, because other people have had all these dramatic power encounters and experiences, and I haven't. And I lived through some of that as a younger Christian, so I would never want anyone to hear, oh gosh, I need to have that dramatic, ground-shaking experience in order to be called into Christian ministry. Sometimes people do, and that's great if it happens. Sometimes it's just the still small voice or God engineering circumstances. That's the way God normally guides me, actually, is he lines the circumstances up such that it's so obvious that this is the only way. That's how I ended up in Solas, for example. Whereas my wife, by the way, would say, she's far more of a hears from God a lot. She'll often come back from praying and go, well, I felt the Lord say, and she's usually right, which is annoying.
Denominational gypsy, I like that. I've similarly sort of flipped between so many different streams, and I love the richness of, no one's got the monopoly on the truth or the right angle on the hugeness of God, have they? So any sort of key moments, any lovely stories from YFC youth work days?
Yeah, I mean, so many good things from those days. One of the privileges from that era was, that era then continued into ministry. So after 5 years with YFC, I was, and part of the Burnout thing, I had to reorientate some things, and actually God eventually used that to draw me into full-time youth ministry. And my first role in ministry was doing 3 years of schools work. So when I was doing YFC and schools work, I mean, it's quite an amazing privilege. You're spending, 8,000-9,000 young people a week you're talking to. So seeing lots of opportunities there. It's really encouraging to see, young people come through and begin exploring coming faith. One of my favorite little stories, because again, it connects to things that interest me, was I ran a Christian Union for some time in Dulwich College, very posh private school in South London. And we had this little Muslim kid who used to come along, whose name was unimaginatively Mohammed. And I've been coming for a few weeks. I sort of collared him as he was leaving at the end of the lunchtime. And I remember saying to him, I said, "Why? I said, do you have interest, Mohammed? Why do you come to the club? Because obviously, you are a Muslim, as I understand it. This is the Christian Union." And he's like, "Oh, am I not supposed to come?" I was like, "No, you are totally welcome. I'm just interested why you would come." He looked at me and he goes, "Oh, well," he said, my mum told me I have to go. She said, listen to everything those Christians tell you, apart from the Jesus stuff, which you need to ignore. But everything else, you do what they say. And he looks at me and he grins and he goes, "I really actually quite like the Jesus stuff, though, so I do listen," which I quite liked. And there was lots of those kind of stories with very unusual people, coming across through the doors of the schools, stuff we did. I did my first ever kind of public dialogue in during those YFC years, where myself and a sixth former actually in one of the schools had a dialogue on the existence of God, and that was really good fun, learning how to have those public conversations in a way that's kind of winsome and engaging, and so on. So that was really exciting. And then the other thing that happened during this time, Simon, was that was where the seed for Muslim ministry was also really, really planted, because I mentioned Ichthus earlier. And it was around this time that Ichthus developed a project where they were sending mission teams of older teenagers and young 20-year-olds abroad during the summer to do 2-3 weeks of mission. And I was co-leading the team to Spain. And I have to say, beach evangelism in Spain, I mean, what is not to like? You get to stand on the beach, talk about Jesus, and eat ice cream. But there was a team going to Turkey. And so as part of the training week, we had a morning on Islam. And a gentleman called Jay Smith came and did a training morning for our bunch of kids on Islam. And it was the first time I'd really heard anything from a Christian working in that area. If anyone listening to this has heard of Jay, you're larger than life, very passionate, very charismatic, very, very...
And we're getting him on in a couple of months' time, so really looking forward to that.
Him up, right? If you could tell Jay that Bannister was the warm-up act. And anyway, one of the things that Jay did, Simon, is he described how every Sunday, he was going to Speaker's Corner in London, part of Hyde Park in London, where you can stand on a ladder or a box, or if you're 5'8" like me, a box and a ladder, and you get a crowd. And he was finding lots of Muslims there, so he was preaching to Muslims, and it was really inspiring. And I remember chatting to him afterwards, and Jay said to me, "Well, why don't you come to Speaker's Corner once you're back from Spain? Come to Speaker's Corner, see what we do." So 4 weeks later, I turned up at Marble Arch Underground Station, and there was Jay with 2 ladders, one over each shoulder. And I went, "Why have you got 2 ladders?" He went, "Well, Andy, I'm going to stand on one and preach, and you're going to stand on the other and preach." I thought, "Jay, you said, come and see what we do." He went, "Oh, best view's up a ladder." I went, "I've never preached on the street before." He went, "It's easy." I said, I've never talked to Muslims before." "Oh, they're easy." Both, yeah, you laugh. Both those things utterly wildly wrong. The Muslims there tore me to pieces. It was an absolute road crash, but it gave me a bug to get into this, because I thought, I need to get some answers. They've asked really good questions, and that drove me to kind of reading to try and find answers to the questions they'd asked. And that was when I first discovered, apologetics and that branch of Christian theology concerned with giving reasons. And that was the pathway, that was the door that God opened that led eventually to further to study and eventually the PhD. And Speaker's Corner was amazing. It's an amazing place. I don't know if you've ever been, but it's...
Yeah, I have. Yeah, give us a... I mean, we've had Hatton Tash on in the
Hatton,
early days, and she was someone tried to kill her, stabbed her there.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's a remarkable lady.
She's very courageous.
Yeah, go on, share some anecdotes from there.
Yeah, so one of the things I used to like about Speaker's Corner was the way the ministry was set up was brilliant, because you'd have folks like Jay, and in time myself, as I got sort of drawn into being a ladder regular, you had those of us on the ladder whose job was to really get people thinking and start a conversation and, for want of a better word, provoke. I mean, you've only got to start challenging Islam and you get a Speaker's Corner, you get a reaction. And then you've got 20 or 30 people, as part of the Christian team who are with you out on the ground, whose job is then to turn to the Muslim next to them and go, so what did you think of that? And most of the really great conversations happen on the ground. And we had some fantastic stories of, friendships forming and really deep conversations kind of happening. I have since heard, of one or two stories of Muslims coming through to faith that started at Speaker's Corner. Speaker's Corner is where it started. It never usually ended at Speaker's Corner. But it was, for some Muslims, I think that was where they'd first ever had encountered the idea that there's a challenge to their narrative. And then the other thing that was great at Speaker's Corner was, after we'd done 2 hours down there doing ministry, we would then go back to and we'd go back and get cheap fried food, usually KFC. Other fried food places are available, and we'd sit around as a team, share the stories, share names of people we had conversations with, pray. If things had gone badly, you could share those stories and people commiserate. If they'd gone well, celebrate together. And it was an amazing discipleship environment. Actually, I know lots of folks who are now in various forms of ministry, and those ministries began at Speaker's Corner because it was I think there's something about creating safe places to fail sometimes in ministry. You need to create a space where people can try stuff out. And if it goes wrong, great. And if it doesn't, whatever. And there's great stories from those days. My favourite Speaker's Corner story, I've got three favourite Speaker's Corner stories, and one of them, two of them, I wasn't there for. The one I was there for was my wife, who I said is quite stubborn and quite feisty. She came to Speaker's Corner one day, and the Muslims in the front row were heckling. And sometimes they could be quite rude. Not all Muslims, but some of them on Speaker's Corner could be. And one of their favourite insults was to call out, "You're gay." That's the insult they would use. They would accuse you of being gay, because in their mind that was the most gratuitous thing you could call somebody. And there's this Muslim in the front row with a beard yelling this at me. And my wife just made her way to the front, tapped him on the shoulder, and looked up at him. He's like 6 foot and she's 5 foot, whatever. And she's like, "How dare you? That is my husband. How dare you?" And she said it was amazing. To his credit, he went white as a sheet and said, I'm so sorry. And she was able to gently share Christ with him. She went, "I forgive you, because that's what Jesus has done for me. But maybe just think before you open your mouth." Jay had a similar one where the Muslim in the front row, that he was accusing Jay of being illegitimate. It was a swear word beginning with B was the word that was used. But on this occasion, Jay's 80-year-old mother had come for a visit and was sitting in a chair by the side of Speaker's Corner. So Jay literally stopped mid-flow and said to this guy, "What did you say?" And the guy repeated it, "You but." And so Jay's like, "Could you possibly go and explain to my mother, who's sitting in the chair over there, why it is you think I was born out of wedlock?" And he said, again, to the credit, because family's important to these guys, this young man went over and apologised to Jay's mum, who Jay said then held this guy's hand in a grip of iron and just preached the gospel at him for 20 minutes. But the most dramatic story at Speaker's Corner I ever heard, I wasn't there for, and that was Jay was speaking there one Sunday afternoon. You can ask him to verify this story, and then when he's on in 3 months' time, if I've got it all wrong, it'd be a disaster. But there's a very well-known Muslim debater called Shabir Ali, well-known Muslim apologist. And some of Shabir's mates were at Speaker's Corner one day. They'd been in London, and I think Shabir had said, "Oh, go along to Speaker's Corner and hear Jay. He's really interesting." And Shabir and Jay have always gotten quite well. And so Jay did his thing, and afterwards he was chatting to these guys afterwards, and one of them turned to Jay and said, "By the way, when you were speaking, who were the two guys in sitting up in the tree? The guys wearing white sitting up in the tree. Were they part of your team? Were they doing something up there?" And Jay went, "I have no idea what you're talking about." And anyway, as the conversation unfolded, this Muslim was convinced he'd seen two men in white sitting in the tree, and Jay ended up saying, "Well, all I can conclude from what you described is they were angels, because they certainly weren't with me and no one else saw anything." But really interesting that a Muslim, of all things, had seen something significant going on.
Well, listen, we're going to come back to Muslim stuff just because that's a key part of your work. But ducking back in the non-sequential...
Consequential autobiography.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. Canada, was that
Canada.
next? No.
Well, Canada, yeah, we could talk about Canada. So yeah, we had 6 kind of amazing years in Canada, which is where I really got into this form of ministry. But that, again, is amazing the way that the Lord kind of works. So to back up, when I met Astrid, my wife, in 1997, 1st of April, 1997, we met. A date she said Simon should have given her a clue. And one of the first things she told me was that she felt God had called us to Canada. I was terrified of flying. Absolutely terrified of flying. You know, if you've anybody of my generation listening to this has watched the A-Team, you want to think Mr. T in the A-Team. That was kind of my, level of fear of flying. And I wasn't getting on a plane, but I began. God eventually dealt with the fear of flying kind of thing through a lot of prayer, and a friend who was a pilot who answered inane questions. But I still had no desire to leave the UK at all. And every time Astrid mentioned Canada, I would dismiss it, I'd rubbish it, I'd change the subject. But I got through the Islam piece when I started doing my PhD in Islam. I got involved in a network of scholars, Christian scholars of Islam, that had been set up by an organization that no longer exists. It ended very badly, an organization called Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, RZIM. This was before that ministry collapsed in scandal. They'd set a network of Islam folks like myself up. And I was in the meeting of this network in Oxford when one of the North American team had mentioned there was a Canada office. And it was, best way I could describe it is I felt like God had sort of put a good light bulb into my brain, a laser beam into my brain saying, Andy, you need to listen to this. So I went home and told Astrid, and she, I think, dropped her coffee mug in excitement. It was the first time in 10 years I had said anything positive about Canada. Mm-hmm. So we prayed about it, and then we reached out to the Canadian office, and the guy running the Canadian office, a guy called Joe Boot, who now lives in the UK. Joe was over. We a few weeks later, we met in Oxford. We got like a house on fire. He said, why didn't you come out to Canada and do a bit of speaking with us? We're looking for a second speaker, so let's give it a go. Maybe it's of the Lord. And then, bless him, he emailed me 2 weeks later to say, oh, sorry, actually, I'm leaving RZM. I'm off to be a pastor. Good luck and goodbye. Well, then suddenly the Canadian board went from we're looking for a second speaker to we're looking for the new front guy. And very quickly things got, Simon, very scarily serious. And yeah, it was a year-long kind of onboarding process, during which God changed me 180 degrees. I can't describe how I went from not wanting to leave the UK and being so thoroughly British to actually really thrilled to get on a plane. And so we moved to Canada in 2010 and had an amazing kind of 6 years out there, crisscrossing the country, doing both evangelism and evangelism training, the two things that I love doing, learning what it means to operate in a new culture and engaging people of all faiths and none. So that was an absolutely fantastic time, and had 2 kids out there. So my kids are actually, they have Canadian passports. We have 2 maple flavored children.
And the fear of your international jet setter now, fear of flying completely gone? I mean, my sister Tracy hates flying. I've seen it up close. So is that completely dissipated?
It is funny. It is completely gone. It's really, really strange. And I think, I genuinely say it was 2 big things. It was, let's say, a friend who was a pilot who I just bombarded with endless questions about, well, how can you be sure the wings won't fall off and all these things? And she just patiently answered question after question after question. And then there was just a lot of prayer, including the first time I had to do an international flight. Astrid and I had to go to America in 2006, I think, and it was pretty unavoidable that I couldn't get out of that one. And I genuinely was sitting in the departure lounge at Heathrow, figuring out, well, maybe I should go to the loo. If I go to the lavatory, maybe I can then exit through a window. And I remember saying to her, I said, I'm going to use the loo, and she went, no, you're not. Because she knew me. She went, you're not going to the loo because I know what you're going to do. You are sitting next to me. You can use the loo on the plane. She wouldn't let me go. She was right. But we prayed a lot. And during that flight, actually, it started in fear. And I went from the white knuckles to actually halfway through the flight, this sort of sense of peace. It was very strange, actually. So I can thank a lot of, the work of the Holy Spirit and a praying wife. And it's never come back. I still don't like it when it gets bouncy. I still, you can still feel the heart rate kind of going. But I do think, and I use this illustration in the book I wrote on evangelism kind of last year. I do think, Simon, one of the things with fear is fear reveals where our idols are. at times. And I think for me, I'm a control freak. I like to be able to control all the variables. And flying, you're not controlling the variables. You're totally out of control. You're sitting in a tin tube with trusting the guy or girl up the front. And I draw on that illustration in the book where I say, for those of us who are afraid of evangelism, lots of Christians are afraid of evangelism. Well, that's a surface level thing. Underneath, what is it? And I think it's fear of looking stupid. It's fear of being disliked by our friends. It's fear of embarrassment, those kind of things. So underneath any big fear, there's usually an idol underneath.
That's good.
So here I am in the middle of nowhere in a field, and as is always the case, a whole bunch of people have gathered around. So I'm just going to try it. This is unrehearsed, but I'm going to see if we can sing a song together. Okay, turi kumwe. Imana ni nziza, Imana ni nziza, Imana ni nziza, ni nziza cyane. Mwese. Imana ni nziza, haleluya. Imana ni nziza, haleluya. Imana ni nziza, ni nziza cyane. You probably know what that means. That means God is so good, isn't it? That's in umpteen languages, but it just shows, isn't it interesting that they all, some of them will be believers, some of them won't be, but they're all so receptive and open to the gospel, and it's beautiful. That's what this podcast actually, one of the reasons we've done it is it's under the auspices of Great Lakes Outreach, and if you want to support the work, this is still the hungriest and the poorest country in the world with incredible troops of high caliber who are doing beautiful gospel work. So if you wanted to back us, go to greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired, and a little money goes a very long way out here. Thanks for your consideration. greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. Now let's get back to the podcast.
Now, I've heard you talk about different highlights of your time in Canada. You had some amazing experiences, didn't you?
Oh gosh, there's so many I could pick on, but the Islam thread has run through. So I think one of my highlights was the last year I was there. The last year I was there, I'd done across the 6 years I was there, I did quite a lot of Islam events and particularly dialogues. I did some debates. Jabir Ali, I mentioned earlier, we did 3 debates together, and that was really exciting, actually, some of the conversations that generated. But the last year I was there, I did a dialogue event in the second biggest mosque in Canada. It was quite funny. It used to be the first biggest mosque, but another mosque had been built elsewhere, and the guys in Toronto, knew they were now the second biggest mosque and were not happy about it. The second biggest mosque in Toronto, run by the Ahmadiyya community, and a particular sect of Islam. And there was myself, another Christian speaker, a guy called Abdu Murray, former Muslim, and Abdu came to Christ about 20 years ago now. So there's 2 of us, and then there were 2 Muslims, and we each had 15 minutes to do a presentation. So I think Abdu spoke on why I am Christian, and then one of the guys went on why I'm Muslim, and then I did a piece on who is Jesus from a Christian perspective, and they did who is Jesus from a Muslim perspective, and then we had Q&A, Simon, 4.5 hours.
Wow.
Q&A. 47 questions. There was a break for curry partway through. I remember around about question 32, Abdu leaning over to me and whispering, "Andy, how do we make it stop?" But what was amazing, what was absolutely astonishing, we had 1,000 people out that night, 400 Christians, 600 Muslims. The number of conversations that started, because we'd done a training event for one of the big churches involved the night before, where we'd said, your goal tomorrow night is to get to know a Muslim. Don't sit with Christians, sit with Muslims. Lots of that happened. But then we had 1 Muslim come to faith that night. Now, you may say 1 out of 600, but if you know anything about Muslim ministry, that's incredibly rare. Right, that you get a response like that on the night. Muslims often take a long time to come through. And then a second conversation that Abdu had with a young man who basically was questioning the Quran, questioning Muhammad. And I remember Abdu said to him, he said, you sound like you are where I was about 3 months before I became a Christian. And they stayed in touch. And that guy then came through to faith in Christ. So we know of 2 Muslims out of that one event who came to faith in Christ. And talking of Muslims coming to faith, that reminds me, it was the other highlight of my time in Canada. It wasn't actually in Canada. It was when I was in Canada, I did a lot of international travel for RZAM. And one of the places I often went was Turkey. We had a Turkish office. And one of my most amazing experiences of ministry in a Muslim country was 1 week in about, I think it was 2015. I was flying out there And the night before we flew out, I was staying with a friend in Oxford before heading up to the airport. And I woke in the middle of the night and can only describe what I felt was this incredibly heavy sort of weight and darkness in the room, really quite oppressive feeling in the room. And I'd never had anything like it before. So I just prayed very hard. I don't know what was going on, but I just prayed very hard, called out to Christ, and the whole thing sort of lifted and felt very different. And when I arrived in Istanbul the next day, I was sharing that experience with my Turkish colleague, who said, that's bizarre. She said, I had a very similar experience the same night. What is going on? And we prayed about it and whatnot. Well, later that week, we were doing some events in Ankara, the Turkish town, and 2 Muslims, again too, responded and came to Christ on the night of the event, which again, and then Senema, my Turkish colleague, said this is very unusual. Often in Muslim settings, you're talking long journeys through. And so our conclusion was only that, the forces, the enemy was not happy with what was going to happen. And so there was a sort of attempt to rattle us at the start. But boy, we prayed through it and saw the Lord come through. So those 2 events, that big dialogue in Canada and the events in the year before in Turkey were highlights. There are many others, but when Muslims come to faith, I get excited.
Yeah, I know one of your colleagues back then, who sadly passed away, Nabil Qureshi.
Yeah.
He was at Ahmadiyya, wasn't he? And Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus was his very influential book. I know you had lots of exchanges with him. Now, one thing that struck me from his book was that his parents, who had lived in the States for decades and had never been invited into a Christian home or anything like that. Can you speak into, the I think the fear that most people in the West have of Muslims and reaching out to them along those lines? Go for it.
Yeah, well, Nabil is interesting. I mean, just as a sort of comic moment there was that debate in the Ahmadiyya Mosque in Toronto. Their motto as a sect of Islam, their motto is all about peace and tolerance. The love for all, hatred for none. That's the motto. Love for all, hatred for none. They had over the door in Toronto. But the initial idea was that it wasn't going to be Abdu was my dialogue partner. It was going to be Nabil. But when they found out that we were going to have Nabil, they were like absolutely adamant that he was not setting foot in that mosque, because they'd known him years ago. And of course, he was now the black sheep in their mind because he left Islam and become a Christian. So Abdu and I joked that they should rewrite their motto, love for all, hatred for one. Because Nabil was persona non grata. Amazing story. Anyone who are listening to this who hasn't read that book, I hugely encourage you to. It's so encouraging. And as you say, what comes through is his love for his family. Actually, he really had carried a burden for his parents. But you're right, they had not had many Christians engage with them. It was when Nabil became friends with a guy called David Wood, who was a Christian, that journey began. And then I had a very similar story, Simon, here in the UK. A good friend of mine in Oxford had worked for some years actually with a Muslim colleague, and finally I think he'd gone to some session somewhere on sharing a faith with Muslims, and so he plucks up the courage to invite his Muslim colleague and his family round for a meal. And they had an amazing time, amazing evening. Faith came up very quickly, and they had a really good conversations about Christ and stuff and all kinds of things. But at the end of the evening, as his colleague was about to leave, he turned to my friend and he said, "Oh, thank you for this evening. It's been amazing." He said, "We've lived in this country for 20 years. This is the first time we've ever been inside a Christian home." And my friend said that really stung him to the heart, because it had taken him about 8 years to, of knowing this guy before inviting him round. So I think there's a fear going on. A number of fears, I think, drive it, Simon. I think firstly there's a fear, we have this very British fear, many of us, of causing offence. So what would happen if I invite a Muslim friend out for lunch or round for a meal or something? What would happen if I say something stupid? To which I'm tempted to be flippant and say, well, just don't say anything stupid. You're not likely to. If you genuinely just try and be friendly and winsome and polite and just take an interest at first, get to know them, it's very unlikely you will cause offence. Secondly, I think we can sometimes have a fear of just how different Islam is, because it is very, very different, and that can throw us slightly. But then again, I think I would always say to Christians, turn that into an opportunity. If you've got a Muslim colleague or friend or neighbour, look for the opportunity to say, look, you're a Muslim. I don't know anything about Islam. Tell me what you believe. And just take an interest, ask lots of questions, because that will naturally enable you, after you've asked lots of questions and taken an interest, to then gently turn the conversation and say, this is really interesting. I'm a Christian, and some of what you shared we have in common. That's fascinating. But there's also some big differences. such as, and then you can talk about those. And your friend is far more likely to listen because you've listened to them. So I think that's an issue. And then thirdly, I think, often when we see Islam in the media, it's the scary, jihadi, radical form of it. And we can have this perception that all Muslims are like that. We may not recognize that, but that is there because you said right at the start, this culture of fear and cynicism, which the media trades in. And I think to realize that, well, firstly, your next door neighbor, your Muslim friend at work is not likely to be a secret jihadi. But then thirdly, even if they were, even if your Muslim friend or neighbor was your enemy, Jesus tells us how to engage our enemy. We need to love our enemy. And sometimes the harder they come, the harder they fall. If you'd met Nabil, 5 years before he encountered David Wood and God led him to Christ, you'd have gone, man, this guy's hardcore. Or in the Bible, I think, look at Saul. If you'd met Saul when he was breathing out murderous threats against the church and, helping in the assassination of Stephen and stuff, you'd have gone, this guy he's beyond the pale, right? And to go, God just brings him to his knees. And God is doing a great work across the Muslim world. So yeah, we as Christians need to really get a vision for reaching Muslims for Christ.
And we've probably all got a Muslim family down our street or across the way, and maybe that could be a challenge out of this podcast. Come on, think. Just go up to their doors, invite them over. Don't serve them beer. Just be relevant, culturally sensitive, and opportunities abound.
Start with coffee and cake. You can't often go wrong with that, and stuff. Or say if you've got a Muslim friend at work, invite them out for a meal at lunchtime. Say, hey, would you grab a sandwich? Be amazed how open Muslims are to talking about faith, which is the other thing, by the way, I like about Muslims. If you've got atheist, secular colleagues, faith conversations can be tougher to start. Muslims, they believe in spiritual things, and they can be much easier to start conversations with. Harder sometimes to stop those conversations, but not difficult to start them.
Yeah, I was doing door-to-door recently and knocked on a door and it was Hassan from Iraq, and he invited me in. I mean, you don't expect to be invited in anywhere, and in all these cases, and invited me. Had a lovely coffee, very open exchange, and very warm. Said, "Come back anytime." He was a really good ambassador for Islam, but that's also cultural, isn't it? In terms of how other cultures are just so much warmer and more open than we are in the West, in our individualistic cultures. Okay, so again, let's move back. So you left Canada. David Robertson, fascinating play. We've had him on, and he's just brilliant, isn't he? And that's another great podcast. What's his called?
The Wee Flea.
Yeah, Quantum.
Oh, Quantum. Yes, Quantum of. It used to be Quantum of Solas. A play on the James Bond movie title, but now just Quantum. Yeah,
so I listened to about 4 podcasts, and yours is one, his is one. Just very good cultural analysis. So he was briefly your boss, was he? He recruited you?
No, never my boss actually. But what happened with David was, so back we went to Canada in 2010, 2015 was when we just felt God beginning to give us a little nudge that our time there was coming to an end, and also at the same time as for us with the family, we wanted our kids to know their grandparents a bit better, and it was hard when you're the other side of the Atlantic. So we began exploring, come back to the UK, and of course RZM was still going. It was high, 4 years before that big explosion in 2020. And so initially we thought, well, we'll come to Oxford. That's where RZM is based there, Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, obvious place to go. And it looked like all the doors would line up for that, really, really easy. And then David Robertson rings me up in mid-2015 to say, I hear you'll come back to the UK. I went, yeah, I am, David. He went, what are you going to do? I said, well, I'm going to go to be part of OCA in Oxford. He went, oh, really? He went, you'll be bored. He said, this big team, it's all identikit people. They want a bunch of little, robots all doing the same thing. And he said, you'll get bored. You're an entrepreneur. You're like me. I went, really? He went, yeah. Why don't you come to Scotland and take over Solas from me? I want to hand Solas on. I've got it started. I can start things, but I can never take them further than that. You are somebody who builds things. You want to take this over. I went, no, I don't. I went, David, that's not going to happen. I'm not coming to Scotland. I remember saying a lot of the words, not even in science fiction is that happening, David. So, bless you, but no. He was like, okay. And we finished the phone call, and David didn't take no for an answer. He then networks his way around the RZM team, the OCA team, going, I hear you got Andy coming. Oh, that's brave. I mean, he's an entrepreneur. Entrepreneurs change things and they cause trouble. And, are you sure about this? Why don't you second him to Solas? We need a new leader up here. He could come to Scotland. And Simon, literally every door that was open to Oxford just swung shut.
Mm-hmm.
And then every door we tried to shut to Scotland, we tried to say no. Just again, it just was so obvious. It just wouldn't shut. And so we ended up in September 2016, sort of blinking in the Scottish sunshine, going, well, here we are in Dundee. And at the point we took over Solas from David, we had the organisation had almost no money because David didn't really do fundraising.
Mm-hmm.
We had a couple of part-time staff who didn't really know why they were there because David, bless him, had hired these great people, but then whizzed on to the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then my favourite one was a board of 7 people. My first board meeting, I went around the room and I asked them all to write down for me what they thought Solas was there to do. What was the purpose of the organisation? We had 7 different organisations in the room. But a resounding sort of echo in the background was the evangelism and the training. And I remember looking at them and saying, look, I'm an evangelist, a communicator and a trainer, those kind of things. I think I can reorientate the organisation and focus on that. If you guys are behind that, let's go for it. If not, then I'll happily get a plane and go south. And God bless them, they went for it. And David, by the way, one thing I hugely value about David is I remember when I put that to David, and I said particularly we're going to take the politics piece because David's very into politics and whatnot. I said we're going to take that out of Solas because I think you can do politics or you can do evangelism. Trying to do the two together doesn't work. And bless him, I remember him looking at me over the fried breakfast and saying, Andy, so when Solas began, it was really supposed to be evangelism. He said, because I'm into so many things, it's kind of sort of mushroomed. He said, I think you're absolutely right. He said, leave the politics and stuff to me. I'll take that. And that's what he did. He set up the Weefly and the quantum kind of stuff. And also the other thing I value about David, the most non-hierarchical leader I've met, because handing on a vision is difficult. People can be tempted to hold on. And he was like, no, I need to let you and the team get on with it. And he served on our board for about 6 months just to give some transition over, and but never interfered. Gave good advice, opened doors for us, was a wonderful person to hang out and pray with and learn, the Scottish scene from. So yeah, I'm a big fan of David, and he's tenacious. Yeah. I mean, some of the stuff that David kind of does, he's willing to say the things that I think need to be said at times. So yeah, that's where my sort of career with Solas began, and I can't believe it's going to be 8 years this year. It's the longest I've been anywhere.
Yeah. Well, highlights of those 8 years?
So those are terrible questions because, how do you find highlights in 8 years? There are many. So I think the first highlight is the way that God has grown the organisation. We've gone from having literally no money in the bank and wondering where the next paycheck is coming from to now it's still exciting and every year is a challenge. But actually, we're now an organisation with a team of 8 doing ministry across Scotland and the UK, and the impact that team is having, I'm really thrilled by. For a small organisation, I think it does a lot, and that's all down to what God's kind of done. It should never have worked on paper, but it has. So that's the kind of meta level highlight, and then individual stories within there. What I love is just seeing people come through to faith, or people transformed in sharing their faith. So just 2 kind of recent stories. I mean, literally kind of recent stories. We had we do a video series called Short Answers, where every 2 weeks we put out a 5-minute video, right, designed for Christians to share with their friends or use at the pub or whatever, those kind of things. And we had a lovely story a few months ago from a pastor who'd emailed us to tell us and to encourage us. He said, I just had a guy start coming to church on Sunday, very new Christian, and he said his journey's faith was this guy had apparently sat down and watched all 150 short answer videos. Wow. One after. It's like, that was never the intention. And apparently he'd said to the pastor, by the time I got to the end, every question had been answered, and so I realized I had to just say yes to Jesus, which is amazing encouragement for me and the wider team. Yeah. And then we do university missions every year, very involved in those. And so there's just before Easter was the big kind of season for that, and really 2 big encouragements this year. One was my colleague Steve Osmond was speaking in Glasgow, kind of university mission week, and got talking to a student at one lunch bar he was doing. And this student's obviously been a fairly new Christian, come to faith last year on the mission week last year. And Steve said, how did you come to faith? And this guy said, well, I came to a session that your colleague Andy was preaching, talking the resurrection. And he said, I can only describe it as when I walked into the room, I was a skeptic. And when I walked out, I was sort of pretty much a Christian because it was so clearly laid out. And he said, it was then the follow-up after that became a Christian. And then I was doing mission week at Lancaster University this year, and it was hilarious. There's a wonderful one of the Mission Week organisers, a young Israeli American student called Lena, who we've just got on Solas podcast coming up. Probably by the time this comes out, she'll be there, and I knew she'd come to faith in the last 2 years or so. Incredibly passionate for the gospel, amazing organizer. Well, on one of the last Friday, the Friday of the Mission Week, the last day, we always start the morning with a prayer meeting. And during the prayer meeting, she was just sharing, and she said, "Oh, of course, Andy, you know that I came to faith through watching one of your short answer videos a couple of years ago." And I said, "Lena, stop right there. I did not know that. Tell me that story." And again, but the funny thing is, Simon, it was the resurrection again. So Glasgow was the resurrection talk, and then Lena had watched a video we'd done on evidence for the resurrection a couple of years ago, and she's a historian. She's studying history at Lancaster, and so that was what compelled me. I hadn't realised there was good historical reasons to take the gospel seriously. So that's just such a privilege, and we get a lot of that as Solas. You're not always there at the moment, but when you hear the stories afterwards. And now we're beginning to get it because we've just done this new book called Have You Ever Wondered, and we're beginning to get the stories in from this. Literally just yesterday, we had a pastor in Dundee email us to say that they've got an Alpha course going on. He'd given a copy of Have You Ever Wondered to everyone on the Alpha course, and one of the ladies on that course, not a Christian yet, had gone home, opened the book, and the first chapter she'd opened at is written by multiple authors. She'd opened it at chapter 13. It's written by a friend of mine called Michael Otts, and he'd written a chapter on there on loneliness. And the pastor said how she just burst into tears because this is the big issue for her. And then what Michael had written was just so helpful. And so she sort of came back to the next Alpha course session just floating because it was just amazing. And I love that God moment of it's the right book, but just the Holy Spirit somehow, literally, the chapter she'd opened it at was the question she had. And I love those moments where you can't engineer it. It's not clever things you've done. It's just clearly God working through the stuff that you've done.
Wonderful. Okay, listen, if we're winding things up, I want to give you a parting sort of 5-minute, get on your soapbox, and I don't know, challenge us. What I love is that you are absolutely on the front foot with the gospel. You're not arrogant, but you are not ashamed. And I see us in the West particularly, speaking as an African Christian, where we're not ashamed at all of the gospel. I'm both British and Burundian. But over here, people are very much on the back foot. And part of this podcast, I want us to be confident. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God for salvation. So go on, just give us a parting few minutes of stirring us up. Firing us up.
That's a dangerous thing to say to an evangelist, right?
Go on.
Well, I mean, you set it up so well. I think we do have this natural British reserve. Most of us do. And of course, I've forgotten you'd got that African background as well. And one thing I'd say straight away, by the way, people listening to us having this conversation, Simon, I know sometimes people go, well, it's easy for you, Simon, it's easy for Andy because you're wired that way. I wasn't wired that way. I've learned to be much more bold and much more confident. Speaker's Corner was part of that journey. God doing other things as part of that journey. So the first thing I'd say to people listening to this, get praying, because look, if God can turn me from being nervous about my faith, we haven't talked about my years in the NHS where I said nothing about my faith. I talk about that in one of my books on evangelism. Or if God can turn me from being terrified of flying to being willing to travel and stuff, God can turn lives upside down. So I think begin by praying. If you're a nervous person, just bring that before the Lord and say, God, can you fire me up? Can you give me confidence? Can you bring people alongside me? Secondly, I think really just be praying that God gives you a love for those around you. Sometimes we make evangelism difficult, I think, Simon. We think, well, I have to get on a stage or learn how to do, street preaching or whatever. You don't. You just have to really be praying for those opportunities with your friends and your neighbours and your colleagues. And so be praying for friends and neighbours and colleagues. Start the day by praying your way around the people that you're going to meet. And you'd be amazed what God does. We've talked about some of the sort of more, perhaps more sort of public stories in my life. Two of my favourite kind of low-key stories of how God works when you pray is we moved into this village called Robertson, just outside Swindon, almost exactly 2 years ago. And my kids became friends with the kids in the street and stuff. And their best mate, my son's best mate, who lives across the road from us, my son decided he wanted to invite him to church. And I confess my wife and I sort of went, oh, okay, well, that might happen, but it might not happen. So we tried to brief Chris for going, well, go invite him, but don't be disappointed if it doesn't come. God will still work through this. Well, lo and behold, Chris trots across the road, invites his mate to church, bold as brass. And lo and behold, his mate comes. And so we've now got this kid across the road coming to church. I've been coming for the last 2 years, and he's got quite a troubled background. It's been amazing the impact that church is having on him. But it gets even more interesting that my son's mate lives with his granny. He doesn't know he doesn't live with his parents because there's a really complicated kind of backstory. No dad on the scene at all, and mum is in hospital at the moment for some big issues going on, and it's a really complicated family background. Well, my wife was talking to the grandmother a few months ago, and literally out of the blue, the granny looks at my wife and says, have you guys been praying for us? I mean, what do you do with that? So my wife just sort of went, well, yes, we have. And the gran just said, well, yeah, well, thank you. And then she shared about there being some big breakthrough and some complicated family stuff around the lad and his mum and stuff that she said. And it turned out that the granny had got a kind of church background years ago. So she just said, well, thank you. Please keep doing that. So that reminds me that God works in these kind of ways. And the last thing I would say, Simon, to encourage people, I think, is that we live in a very spiritually open age. We think all of our friends are hostile and closed off. I think there is this move beginning of people being more spiritually open, but just not knowing what to do with that. And I mentioned the Have You Ever Wondered book, blatant plug. Folks can find that at 10 of those. We partner with 10 of those to do this because they make it cheap as chips. You can go to the 10 of those website, buy one, get one free for a friend. And we called it Have You Ever Wondered? Because I think people are wondering. I think people are wondering about justice and what that means. They're wondering why they're drawn to beauty, why spirituality intrigues them. You drop the word spirituality into a conversation down the pub, you'll find some people will scoff, but vast amounts of people will be, yeah, I'd call myself a spiritual person. And I think what the challenge is for us as Christians, and the opportunity, is to go, okay, how do we then connect those urges and those longings and those desires to the story of Jesus? I think we are very much back in first century times. So it's not that people believe nothing, they believe anything. And yes, we need to do a bit of rethinking, but actually there's an opportunity there. So evangelism doesn't need to be terrifying because you're not dealing with hostile, secularists a la Richard Dawkins. There's a few still kicking around. But the majority of people are just lost and confused and wondering. And so a massive, massive opportunity there. So get out there and give it a go. And do check out the Solas website. There's loads of free resources there to help you and equip you and encourage you. Take anything you want, borrow it, use it, copy it, repost it, just pass it around your church, whatever. Anything that helps you be engaging with your friends and your colleagues with the gospel.
Wonderful. Can people be in touch with you?
Again, through the Solas kind of website. I'm sure you'll put a link in the show notes, but if not, if they just Google Andy Bannister, you'll kind of land on the Solas website, or you put my name into Facebook or X as it is now is, or Instagram. I'm on all those kind of things. Always happy people want to reach out, questions, comments, suggestions, ideas. If you're wrestling with you've got a friend at work who's got a tough question about faith that you're wrestling with, do reach out. Always happy to help if we can.
Wonderful. Thanks, Andy. Oh, it's been great. Really enjoyed it. Thanks for your time.
And likewise, been a great be on the podcast, Simon. Strength to you.
Brilliant. Okay, folks, give us a great review, please, on Spotify, iTunes. You can be in touch with me, simongilbo.com. I want to thank Adam Thomas Steer for the editing and Mike Sanderman for the mixing. Next week, another fantastic guest. In the meantime, go well, God bless you, and toodaloo.